All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to Caoilinn in Conversation, where Caoilinn Hughes, coming to us from Ireland through the power of Zoom, seeks out the finest writers from the UK and Ireland and chats with them about their most recent novel. We cannot thank Caoilinn enough for the incredible array of writers that she has had over the last 2 years. This one rounds out our event schedule for 2022, and Caoilinn has certainly taken us out in style. She'll be in conversation with Louise Kennedy, whose new novel, Trespasses, recently released here in the States. Congratulations, Louise. And has been praised by the likes of Nick Hornby and Emma Donoghue, among other stellar writers. I want to personally thank Louise for writing one of my favorite novels this year, as well as turning me on to the smooth sounds of Ottilie Patterson. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. A wonderful Northern Ireland blues singer from the 1950s and 60s. I really fell down a rabbit hole in the last month or so. Thank you so much. Let's meet our guest. Louise Kennedy grew up near Belfast. Trespasses is her first novel. She is also the author of a collection of short stories, The End of the World is a Cul-de-sac. She's written for The Guardian, The Irish Times, and BBC Radio 4. Before becoming a writer, she worked as a chef for almost 30 years. She lives in Sligo, Ireland. Of course, Louise will be in conversation with Caoilinn Hughes, whose latest novel, The Wild Laughter, won the 2021 Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award and is a perennial exile favorite. Her first novel, Orchid of the Wasp, won the Collier of Bristol Prize and was a finalist for 4 of the prizes. Her short fiction won the Moth Short Story Prize, the Irish Book Award Story of the Year, and an O. Henry Prize. Before we get started, I would like to ask those of you tuning in this afternoon to please mute yourselves, but keep your cameras on so that our guests don't feel like they're speaking into a void. Type any questions you might have into the chat, and Caoilinn will ask them of Louise around the 40-minute mark. You can purchase signed copies of Trespasses. Let's show you that. Wonderful cover. And Wild Laughter. If you go to the link in the chat, we ship throughout the US. Please help me in welcoming Louise Kennedy and Caoilinn Hughes. Enjoy the show, and thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you, Javier. Hello, Louise. You're still muted, but that's okay because I'm gonna read an embarrassing spiel about you. Well, just before I get into it and start kind of blushing with delight at being able to launch this book in the US and celebrate this the wonderful human being that is Louise Kennedy. I should warn audience members that we're going to be a little shorter today, so it's probably at around the 50-minute mark. I'm going to kind of wrap things up because Louise actually she's in the building of going to a live event next. So we're catching her right before she goes on stage, and hopefully she'll get all of the fascinating stuff out on us and then go out on stage. No, I don't want you to be a wet blanket, Louise, anywhere. But so if you've got questions, type them in as we go, and I'll look in at the half-hour mark. So Javier read a bit of Louise's bio there, and it's an admirably modest bio for what could be in there. So I'm just going to pump up the jam a little bit and add the fact that Louise was the first author ever to be shortlisted twice for the Sunday Times Audible Short Story Prize, which is currently suspended. There's no sponsor at the moment, and maybe this is someone trying to sabotage Louise being on there a third time. But it's got her first book was, I've only got the galley in this. I live between different places, so The End of the World is a Cul-de-sac, which I believe will be coming out next year in the US, was praised kind of unprecedentedly really for a first book, and it's really incredible. It also won the John McGahern Story Prize, and it was a Sunday Times Book of the Year. And anyone said something about the book, but I think the quote that I liked the most was from Emma Donoghue, who said, like 15 novels squeezed between 2 covers, ready to blow your mind. The only other writer I can think of who packs this much moving, terrible life into each story is Alice Munro. So all of our North American listeners will have that to look forward to next year. And today is the launch of Trespasses in the US. It's just out with Riverhead, with that gorgeous cover that Javier just held up. And it's a really different book to the short story collection. So I think we'll get a sense of what the book is like, obviously, as we chat. But I just wanted to start off by asking you how the novel came about, and if you felt all of a sudden that you were writing something that wasn't a short story.
Well, I knew that I was writing a novel because that was a decision, I suppose. But maybe the first thing that I wrote for the book, I didn't write it as part of the novel. So the book begins with a prologue and ends with an epilogue. And the prologue was probably the first part of Trespasses that I wrote. And that came out of a trip into the Ulster Museum at the tail end of their Art of the Troubles exhibition of 2014, which was hugely controversial in the way that these things are in post-conflict society. So some people felt that the exhibition had gone too far. Other people felt that it hadn't gone far enough. And I suppose there's still so many people walking around the north of Ireland carrying a lot of pain. And, you know, a lot of I suppose a lot of the peace process has really been quite unsatisfactory for them because there's still a dearth of convictions, and now it looks as if there won't be any. So all of these things are very problematic. But there was still the remnants of that exhibition on show, and I suppose it got me thinking about how maybe a piece of art, could be used to say the unsayable, and especially in a place where language is so fraught. So that's where I came up with the idea for the piece of sculpture that opens and closes the book. But yeah, I did know that I was writing a novel from the outset, because in late 2018, I thought that maybe I should try to start, have a go at a longer piece of work. And part of that was to avoid working on the critical part of my PhD, which I hated. And I thought that at least if I was trying to write a novel or do something else, I wasn't idle. But it wasn't really terribly serious. So I made a playlist and I made a few notes. And I spent very many happy, amusing hours watching absolutely ludicrous videos on YouTube from the North in the 70s, which were really strange for me to look back on, because I could remember some of the newscasters and things. And also, I suppose, just as a reminder of how completely bonkers it was to live there. So I suppose the novel then seems to become quite urgent. Then the following year, like in March 2019, I got a diagnosis for melanoma. And I think I probably realised that I couldn't presume that I'd, have 20 or 25 years to wander around the place from writing a novel when I wasn't actually doing any work. I knew I'd have at least 2 months off work. It ended up being 3. So I suppose, I'd gone through, all 3 series of Call My Agent on Netflix in the first few days at home, and was binge watching other things, and just thought, oh God, just like get your backside in the chair and write. So I tried to. I made a deal with myself that I'd try and write 1,000 words every day, and I really didn't feel that I was getting very far with it. But within 3 months, I did have a draft, a very messy draft, but there was a draft there.
And that was so it was a novel by design, by intention.
By intention, absolutely, yeah. No, I was never really confused about it, but I think that maybe before that something had begun to happen with the short stories. So there's one story, it's the final story in the collection, and it gave me terrible trouble. I wrote over 60,000 words to end up with about 8. And it took me over a year, and I couldn't understand really what was wrong until I began to actually write a novel, when I thought, okay, that's what all the problems were. It was that I was maybe trying to compress a novel into a short form, or something. So maybe the ideas were just getting a bit more complex.
Yeah. Is that Sparing the Heather? Is that the one that took?
No, it's Garland Sunday.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can certainly feel in some of those stories that they could be certainly full-length films, or so it would have been an inevitability. There definitely are short story writers, I think, that are that don't really have that impulse, but if they come from the stories themselves, that's really a kind of satisfying signal. But just to give an overview, I often find that I can go through these things and not really give readers a sense of what the novel is, and to kind of free you of that burden of describing it. It's a historical novel. Thank feck, probably is fair to say.
I have to interrupt you there as well. I'm a bit freaked out about something that is about kind of my life, that was set in my lifetime, is history. but I guess I just need to get my head around my age or something.
Yeah, I know. I suppose though that there's such, I would have thought like the end of Operation Banner would be such a demarcation in time of that would kind of make it historical for me, because there's often, I suppose, that question, if you're talking about the north of Ireland and the, or the Troubles kind of internationally, people will kind of want to have a sense of when that finished, and so because is it still really history, is very much part of the, and certainly now, people who don't know anything about the history, probably in all of the rhetoric about Northern Ireland and Brexit and the protocol and all of that, they might think, well, has that still all bled into this century? But so anyway, with that, I'm sure you'll have things to say on that. But to give a sense of the novel, it presents a protagonist called Cushla, who is a primary school teacher, and she lives with her mother, who has alcoholism, and she occasionally works in the family pub alongside her brother. And she's not based in a sectarian part of town, but at the same time, there's no neutral parts of Belfast, I'd say, it's safe to say. And there are two quite charged relationships that kind of drive the novel. One with a married barrister who would be described as Protestant, and one with a young pupil whose father is in prison, and so who's so badly in need of care. And so they're both kind of love-based relationships. And so please add anything that you feel is central to the synopsis of the novel, Louise. And I was going to ask if you if you felt it was historical as you wrote it. You mentioned kind of doing some research by way of YouTube videos and so on. Like, did you have to, you grew up in Hollywood, which is an area in Belfast, an interesting place to grow up for many reasons, but partly I would imagine that seeing ferries leaving all the time would enter your psyche in some way. So yeah, did you have to kind of approach it as a novel that needed some research?
I think that I knew it was going to need research. It wasn't necessarily that I wanted to do it, but I think I was very conscious of the responsibility of making up a story that was set in times that were really quite grimly real. And so I wanted the world to be as authentic as possible. And there were things, I have a very good memory, and there were things that I remember, from my, like, I could have been one of Cushla's pupils because I was 8 in 1975, the year in which the book is set. So things that happen in Cushla's classroom, things that she does with the children, their school day is very much like my school day would have been, beginning with the Hail Mary and then the news. And I suppose our preoccupations were very like the ones of Cushla's pupils, where the boys were very interested in football. And we were concerned about whether the Bay City Rollers were still number one, all that kind of stuff. But then we were also living in a place where I think especially the adults around us were under tremendous stress and trying to protect us from that. But in a strange way, because of the demographic of the place that we lived in, the way to protect us from it was to kind of encourage us to be circumspect and to be silent and just to be watchful or something, which isn't really very healthy. So there were all of those things. I had a lot of long conversations with my parents, my aunts and uncles, who we had a bar in Hollywood in the 70s that was sold in 1975, and so they were able to confirm lots of details for me, things that I'd heard, the sort of anecdotes and stuff, family lore, I suppose. And then there were other things that I remembered. I suppose, if I put Cushla and her mother in front of the television, then it's like, okay, what are they watching? So I didn't just want the TV to be on. So that's why maybe when the radio's on, the news is on, or there are news flashes, or then they watch the news, the evening news in the pub. This is something that everybody watches. But also things like that interview with Helen Mirren. That was a total gift. That happened to be screened during that time. It was on TV when Michael Parkinson just did that like horrendously sexist interview with the young Helen Mirren. So that kind of fitted in which was kind of a gift. And then there were like game shows, like the Generation game that was on TV. I was able to use that. And the only thing that didn't correspond, even the news, as the children relay the news every day, or when maybe the radio is on in the background and the announcer is saying something. Every one of those news flashes more or less corresponds to a news flash of that day in the corresponding day in 1975, because I wanted all of that to be real. I mean, it's kind of incredible to think that that was during an IRA ceasefire, but yet there was still carnage every single day. I checked a lot of things like that. The only thing that I included that happened, it actually happened the following year. It was made the following year, was sort of a PR film that was made for the RUC that was called Police Day. That was actually screened. I think it was shown first in 1976, but it was just such gold. I couldn't bear not to use it.
There are details from the pub that felt incredibly real. As in, how can the imagination come up with this? Like, for example, the customer with the cooked egg in his pocket, who I'm not sure if it's the same customer who kind of says to Cushla at one point, when she's a young woman, that he'd like to bath her. That felt worryingly derived from experience, but you don't need to confirm or deny. Oh, Louise, you've gone mute there. I don't know why I shouted.
So the man who, the man with the egg in his pocket was invented, but my aunt was probably in her late teens, and she's very tall like me, and she used to work the odd shifts in the pub, and one customer one night told her he'd love to bath her. In fact, it's the exact words were, "I'd love to bath you, big girl." Shocking. That's shocking. Yeah, the 70s, unbelievable.
Yeah. But I did find, I must say, the idea of the kids being asked their news, I found that really touching. You might, I don't know, because you didn't have an alternative to that experience. I mean, it felt almost like an act of bravery, and I couldn't tell if that was just Cushla being a really great teacher, in the sense that I don't think the teachers that I had would have braved asking that question, because you never know what kids will come out with, and I don't know whether it would be asked today, but those kind of...
that was kind of, I think that was a thing, like all of the teachers in our school did it. I think it was a thing,
Okay, yeah.
And it also was a kind of a competitive carry on as well, I remember my little sister coming home from school at the age of about 7, outraged because a boy in her class had been asked to report the news, and he said, I think I have it in the book, there was a bomb in Belfast, and the rest of the class were disgusted that he didn't know what the bomb was made of, and he didn't know if a warning had been given or anything, that he just should have been better informed. Crazy stuff.
Mad. I might ask you now, actually, just because I can see time slipping away, and I really want to have 3 hours with you, Louise, but I don't. I might just ask if you'd mind reading, and even if you feel like it, you can also stop at the end of the first page. It's just to get the tone of it.
Yeah. This is the first time I've read from the lovely US edition. Actually, it's very nice. Cushla wrapped her handbag in her coat and pushed it into the gap between the beer fridge and the till. Her brother Eamon was bent over the counter with the stock list. He looked up at her and his eyes narrowed. He inclined his head at the mirror that ran the length of the bar. Cushla leaned in to check her reflection. Father Slattery had marked her with a thick cross 1 inch wide and 2 inches long. The rub of her finger raised the piney resinous scent of whatever blessed unguent the ashes were mixed with, and blurred the cruciate shape to a sooty smudge. Eamon slapped a wet serviette into her hand. "Hurry up," he hissed. Most of the men who drank in the pub did not get ashes on Ash Wednesday, or do the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, or go to Mass on Sunday. It was one thing to drink in a Catholic-owned bar, quite another to have your pint pulled by a woman smeared in Papish war paint. Cushla buffed until the skin on her forehead was pink, the serviette blackened, flittered. She tossed it in the bin. Eamon muttered something under his breath. The only word Cushla could make out was Egypt.
It's such a genius opening, and I'd love if any of the North American participants in the audience can mention in the chat if they were able to immediately identify those Ash Wednesday ashes on the forehead, because that's ubiquitous in, at least in the Republic of Ireland, and I remember kind of as a 9-year-old or so, an aspiring atheist, going into the school bathroom and kind of deciding, going through the whole process of thinking, that's something that's been done to me that I didn't necessarily want, but I thought, it's innocuous enough. It's not, it's a bit, it seems so daft, but I still did remember kind of using spit to take it off rather than going to the tap. But it's so clever in the novel because, of course, it's externalizing identities, and it's just a great shorthand for not having to go through that kind of more non-fiction style of showing how these things are omnipresent, or visible. And those identities are so immediately, even with Cushla's name. And when I lived in Belfast, I remember as soon as I said the name Caoilinn, and I used to go around to those towns. I used to go around to the towns doing the fundraising for charities, and at some towns I'd go, "Hello, I'm Anna, I'm from London," and just because I knew I was never going to sign anyone up with my own name.
But, a friend of mine had a job working in a bar with a lot of kind of loyalist former paramilitaries drank in Belfast, and she had so they all knew that her name was Mairead, which is an Irish name. She was a Catholic from Tyrone, but they gave her a badge that said Beverly or something, because it's just a name that the Catholics would very rarely have. So this is how she used to walk around at work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Did you know that was your opening image for the novel? Was that how you started? Which, I'm just asking because it's such a clever way in.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to be clever at all. I just had Cushla walk into. I knew that I wanted the relationship to play out over Easter, because I did want at some point there to be the kind of Easter Sunday carry on with Cushla at home, and just this sort of, I don't know, I think I kind of like the idea of maybe playing with Lent or something where it's supposed to be about sacrifice and stuff, but actually instead Cushla's embarking on this kind of very indulgent affair. I just had a scene that opened in the bar, and I think maybe when I really thought about living in the north, a lot of my memories were about us really trying to hide any overt signs of identity, and that thing of rubbing off the ashes was something that happened. So that just came to me really quickly.
Yeah, and there are those details then when the shock of not having to go through those rituals when she goes to Dublin at a certain point in the book, and not having to open her handbag, when she goes.
All of those things were really strange for us when we left the north and moved to the south, when we didn't have to be searched walking into shops and stuff. For the first month there was a lot of confusion of just like waiting around and thinking that people were being terribly irresponsible by not having metal detectors in the doorway of Quinsworth in Naas or something. It was just ridiculous.
So the historical incident, there's a bunch of historical specific incidents referenced in the book, but there's one that happens just before the book's narrative takes place, which was a huge strike following efforts to create a power sharing government in Stormont. And for any just because of the audience that it is tonight, I'll just explain in case anyone doesn't know that Stormont is the government. Well, it's a shorthand for the building where the Northern Irish Assembly is seated. So that's the devolved legislature for Northern Ireland. So there's devolved legislature is also in Wales and in Scotland, and Stormont has historically been really chaotic, and so this is kind of in this power sharing kind of collapse reference just before the book. It's just ironic, because obviously Stormont is suspended at the moment and has been since February this year. So the political kind of machinations in the book are always given through the personal. There's a one night when the central couple Cushla and Michael get together in the evening and kind of ask how their evenings were. Michael had been to the theatre and his show had been interrupted because there was a bomb outside the Lyric. And Cushla, she was at her friend's wedding and the wedding was raided by the army. So, you know, nobody was injured in either context, but it's just this sense of the book seems to be about how people carry on with their normal lives in kind of a war context. Was that kind of what you felt that you were writing about, or trying to see if it was possible in the arena of Cushla's, you know, mindset? And
yeah, well, I think that maybe what I was trying to do was I mean, I set out to write a love story, really, but once I set it in that time and place, the troubles just seemed to infect everything that they did. So that wasn't, I mean, it just seemed to be necessary, because that is how it was, that if you went shopping, you had to queue for a long time, that you were searched, you know, patted up and down. You know, there's at one stage, Cushla mentions, oh, you know, they were shaking out people's umbrellas. I saw that happen when I was a child. I was with my granny and she had an umbrella and she was told to open it because, you know, they were looking for devices all the time. Even short car journeys were interrupted by roadblocks. You know, we didn't live in, we lived on a kind of quiet street in a bungalow, you know. We didn't have soldiers on the streets, but yet it was a garrison town and the soldiers were there all the time. But I think for a lot of people, a lot of the death was quite random, that you just had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you know, like shops were bombed, hotels were bombed, bars were bombed. So all of the ordinary things, just the ordinary just became really fraught and frightening. And also, I suppose, like at one point, maybe, I think around the time that the book is set, I think the number of British troops peaked at 30,000, which is crazy. It's a very small place. It's like 6 small counties. And to have that number of troops present, it really beggars belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you know, and it just, you really felt it all the time. I think as well, maybe because we had a pub that soldiers drank in. That was a factor, and then there were other things too. You know, later on in my childhood, after our pub was sold in 1975, but after that, my father took a job in business on the Newton Ors Road, which is in Protestant East Belfast, really the heartland of East Belfast. And when he got there, he realised he was the only Catholic among a workforce of about 150 people. And, you know, a couple of times he was followed home by, you know, a motorcyclist with a pillion passenger who followed him to the end of our driveway. You know, so I just think all of it was kind of terrifying. So it wasn't that I thought, oh, I need to do this, that, and the other to show what it's like. I think I was just really drawn from my memory of what it was like.
Yeah, understandably. And yeah, it's social realism. I mean, it very much so. It's not kind of stylized at all, but there and the lack of privacy, you know, that's the consequence of that kind of watching and needing to be watchful, those kind of dual lessons that are going on. It does make it feel claustrophobic, you know.
Yeah, I think maybe as well for Cushla that she's under a different type of surveillance in that you know, Cushla is educated, but yes, she's a young Catholic woman. In those days, even though she was very aware, and I suppose everybody was aware, that the broader kind of world had become a lot more permissive, she's still expected to stay at home with her mother until some nice Catholic fella, ideally a virgin, comes along and decides to marry her. And, you know, her mother probably half hopes that that'll be Jerry, who she works with, but that's never going to happen. But, you know, so I think that, you know, there are other constraints on her as well, you know, that her brother and her mother, and I suppose the people who run the school are sort of watching people's behaviour too, in a moral sense, not just, you know, it isn't just to do with the troubles.
Sure. And yeah, and you know, I won't spoil anything about the book about how, but certainly there are powers that be surrounding the school that try to kind of restrain her tendencies to be simply human with the children, because you know it is very much about how violence can become, or you know, benign, or like, and kids being brought up in an environment and within families and within communities that can't ensure their safety, and so the methods of trying to cope with that are, you know, her mother having gone to alcoholism, you know, and relinquished maybe that responsibility. I think Cushla's, you know, response to that trauma is to try and offer care and kindness, and to kind of extricate herself from those powers, you know, which are, you know, oppressive from many different levels, as you say. So I'll have a peek at the questions in a minute, but there's so much I want to ask, and I know I won't get to ask you at all. They go to see it. So there's the political context. That's one thing. There's a really, really rich cultural context in the book. And they go to see a play early on in the book, actually, in the while after Hart is reading Philadelphia, Here I Come, and he goes to see Wally Gongora. So it really felt lovely to see that permissible in novels, because it's a very I mean, who would advise that in a writing class? You know, write a novel and have them go to see a play.
Yes.
To play. But I'd love to ask you about that, you know, and Friel in general. I don't know whether or not there's a kind of a big influence with you, but I know that he certainly was very, very present when I was in Belfast. And I remember when the Queen's Film Theatre got named the Brian Friel Theatre, and it feeling like, you know, I don't know, we had the feels. Was that kind of, is that really something that you had to kind of construct a way to allow those influences in? Or was it just the case that when you were thinking about
I think that actually maybe, if anything, because I had reread translation, so I suppose that I was kind of thinking about that when Cushla was trying to teach English to these people who I still maintain who were really just playing it, and they were playing it being Irish. Other people have, it's kind of interesting, you know, when you write a book that people see things in it where I think that your intention was possibly different, or that, you know, the effect is different or something. So yeah, I think that there was maybe a bit of Friel, but also I have to admit that I did check what play was on in the Lyric in March 1975, and it was a production of Philadelphia, Here I Come, starring a very young Liam Neeson.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect you know, play for you know, speaking to some of the themes of this novel as well, of trying to kind of that battle between how you present yourself and how you are, but so wonderful. The other one that that comes up a lot, well, maybe on the Irish language thing. So there are Irish language books mentioned, so Cushla, the protagonist of this novel, is invited to give Irish language lessons to a group of people who aren't necessarily on the same racial spectrum. I always thinking about it as race, because it's, you know, like it just feels so ridiculous to say religious when people aren't necessarily religious. And I wonder, yeah, was Irish part of your experience, Louise, growing up? Because for me, it was the opposite. So I did my BA and MA in Queens, but I'm from Galway, and you know, I'm Rathgaeltacht area, so there would be, like, you know, you definitely throw in the cúpla focal almost every, which is Irish for a few words. It sounds like a curse word, but it isn't. You know, frequently. But then when I went to Belfast, I felt that actually speaking Irish at all was a kind of political act, and I felt nervous. I wanted to understand the place and not really kind of bring too much of myself. I wanted to, you know, when you're that age, you want to absorb and see what somewhere is. So it felt really politicized. But so did you have access to Irish? Was it mandatory in school?
No, not at all. So in my primary school, teachers would, so we all, I think at some point, one of our teachers taught us the Hail Mary in Irish. Cushla does that, and with the children. And then, you know, sometimes we'd learn a few words, but no, there was no mandatory Irish whatsoever in primary school. And then I did a year in secondary school in the north before we moved, and I did some Irish then. And when we moved, I had the option not to do Irish in school, and lots of people were urging me not to do it. They were saying it's terrible, it's really hard, and sure it's dead language and stuff. But I wanted to do it. But I don't know if it was me or a reflection on how it was taught, but I did leave school with very little Irish, which bothered me terribly. So when I was writing Trespasses and writing those scenes where Cushla is teaching Irish to Michael and his friends, I thought that I'd get a chance to fix and expand on all of that Irish myself, because I planned to go away to the Gaeltacht, which is like an Irish speaking part of Ireland, and do an immersive course for a week, and that I would, brush up on all of my old Irish that way. But then the pandemic happened, so I never got to do it. I did get to do it in the summer just gone by. I did a week in Guidor, doing Rangana Gaelga, which was really great. And yeah, once a week I go into a Zoom with a coming from Belfast and do some Irish that way. But yeah, the Irish language is hugely politicised. But when I was a child, even the GAA was politicised. That Gaelic sports such as Gaelic football and hurling the results were not given on the BBC News. They are now, but that had the effect at the time of really there was no Irish language. In the 6 counties on TV, you just didn't hear any of it. Gaelic sports were ignored, and it really did have the effect of making us think, like, are we even here? And it did politicise things to a huge extent. But yeah, I suppose the other way of looking at it is that it's a cultural movement as opposed to the horrors that went beforehand, so that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it does seem there's still room, I think, for it to shift, in the coming kind of decades.
Yeah, absolutely.
That people's comfort with that, and I think just also a shifting demographic, a shifting kind of generation in that sense, and attitudes towards language and what warrants protection is also kind of that the narrative around that is changing. There's a lot of science, that has been published in the last 10 years that wasn't previously available about the benefits of having any second language, no matter what it is, no matter how much utility it adds to your life, that your brain develops in a different way and that you're better across.
Yeah, I bet. And I found actually that I was actually a very poor student in my Irish classes during the summer because, we'd be told a literal translation for something, and I just get so carried away with how beautiful it was. That if you say that, so a bird can be, so say a plane is flying, okay, so it's like egg etched, but a kite is in flight. Air etched. So I would sit and ponder this for about 5 minutes, and then they'll have moved on through about 3 important grammar points that I completely missed. So I don't know, maybe I'm just hopeless.
I'm going to ask there's an audience question in here. If anyone else wants to ask anything, now's the time. From Ruth Smith. She says, absolutely fantastic writing, Louise. There's lots of delicious irony, especially in the final section. Yet Michael fulfills some Protestant stereotypes. Rich, middle class, entitled with a question mark. What lay behind this characterization, and how did you decide where to inject the irony?
Yeah, so I don't know. I do think that I hope I didn't treat Michael too ironically. I think maybe in earlier drafts he was a little bit more matinee idol. He was a bit too perfect or something. So by about draft 3, I gave him a bit of a drink problem, and by about draft 4, it turned out that he's had a few other affairs and stuff like that. But I think that maybe Michael is, he's somebody who hasn't forgotten the reason why he trained as a lawyer, where he still believes in sort of the principles of justice, which is very difficult in that place at that time when the diplomat courts were functioning, where there were no juries, kind of 3 judges and no juries and that sort of thing. And I think I just wanted Michael to be somebody who'd sort of try and, hold on to his principles. Now, he isn't completely principled, obviously, with the carry on of him in other ways. But I do think that, I don't feel particularly bad about treating some of the others, you know, with a good bit of irony, you know, the likes of Victor and stuff, because I think that every Catholic nationalist from the North has probably been in circumstances, you know, certainly when I was growing up, I hope to God it's improved a lot, where they did feel, you know, at best othered, but certainly made to feel less by people who don't even realise they're being offensive. So yeah, I think that, yeah, I probably did tap into that feeling, or those feelings, to write the other characters.
That's understandable. No novels are written from neutral perspectives. And there's loads to ask you. My brain's firing. Ask about whether or not you were writing into, or conscious that you'd be writing into a historiography, you know, as well. But anyway, don't answer that, because there's going to be more interesting questions from the audience. John Ger O'Riordan has said, wonderful discussion. What advice would you give to a mature someone who is only starting out writing short stories? Many thanks and continued success, Louise.
I would say just keep writing short stories and keep trying to get as good as you can at them. That's all I would say. Just keep working. And I don't know if you've begun to submit them to journals or competitions, but that can be a really good way to see if, you know, even a long listing can be so encouraging at the start. So I'd really recommend that. I was in a writing group when I started to write in the beginning, and that was really helpful for me, because you know, I'd bring my stories into a room of 7 or 8 people, and if one of them said, oh, I didn't get that, then, you know, I didn't necessarily have to take it on board. But if 7 people are saying that transition doesn't make sense, then they're probably right. So I find all of that really helpful. So that's the advice. I'd say just keep at it.
Yeah, community and keep working. So Eileen Clancy has said, only just started reading the US edition of this magical book. She's on page 6. She says, you described the TV news, noting that it opens with, quote, a montage of short scenes, a riot. Did you think about writing a film or TV much while writing this, I guess?
No, I didn't, but that's a great question, because I think that I probably think quite visually, you know, so I can picture things. So I think I do that with the stories as well. That I need to have a really strong sense of what characters are looking at, or what's around them, or what they can smell or taste or see and hear. So yeah, I think
there's a lot of cooking. There's a lot of cooking.
A lot of cooking. But yeah, and also that is pretty much what I remember from the news. That was more or less the way the news was introduced. The local news, there was a program called Scene Around 6 that was on all through the 70s, and that's how it began. And it was all stuff, you know, to do with the Troubles and Mary Peters with her Olympic medal.
One other of the many cultural kind of references in the book is Edna O'Brien. I think one of the characters is borrowing an Edna O'Brien novel. And there is something Edna O'Brien-esque about this book. I think more so than your stories. For me, reading your stories, it reminded me of someone like Dermot Healy. I don't know if you know Dermot Healy, but maybe the novel is even a touch more tender. I'm interested in, you know, when did you read Edna O'Brien? Was she someone that you read when you were a teenager, or was that something did you come to her later?
Yeah, I mean, I read, I think, a copy. I read a copy. I found a copy of The Country Girls in the library in school, but I think it wasn't really meant to be in there, because it didn't have, all of the other books in school had like a little kind of flap thing where you put a card in, and this didn't have that. And I just like to think that an older girl or a teacher or something left that there in the hope that some of us would find it and read it, because it was banned until the late 60s, and this probably wasn't so much later. It was 10 or 12 years later. So yeah, that was the first Edna O'Brien book I read, and I guess I've read it all my life. I read all of the short stories, and there are very many, and they're wonderful. And I think that maybe some of my reading around the time leading up to writing Trespasses, one of the books, a couple of her books that I read, The House of Splendid Isolation, which is a book that is very loosely based on Dominic McGlinchey, who was a Republican operative, I suppose, who went on the run, and so she wrote about him, and really beautiful novel about him. And then another book of hers is Into the Forest, which is about a very different story. Again, it's based on something that happened. It was the abduction of a young woman and her child, and then a priest by a very disturbed young man in County Clare in the 90s. And so it wasn't the subject matter so much that I wanted to read, but I just think that she makes really violent, awful things very beautiful.
That's what I mean with the tender. Yeah, she's very brave, I think.
Yeah, she's so brave. I mean, at 85, 86, she was standing at an airport in Lagos with like wads of cash in her underwear, with which to bribe officials so that she could write about those girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram, which is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah. I have a Nigerian novelist friend who lives in Berlin who just kind of, we were talking about Edna O'Brien, and after a while he just said, oh, she reached out to me and we went and had coffee when she was doing research for this. So she did all sorts of work behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. That's just for someone at where she is in her career, she's not taking anything for granted.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
One more question from the audience. I think it's probably maybe the last one we can squeeze in from Luz. I read Louise's short story Hunger recently, and it prompted me to write a piece about hunger and who is allowed to say they had particular experiences in Ireland, depending on their religion, background, etc. Who is allowed to say they went hungry? So I don't know if that's a question. Who is allowed to say? I don't know if that's a question. I think it's maybe a thought. If you don't have a response to that, there's another question that's popped up, and maybe you'll want to say something to both. From Michael McGee. This one is for Louise. Will you be in Sligo on Saturday afternoon? Your mate Mickey wants to call in for a cup of tea.
I certainly will, Mickey. I might even make you a cake if you're very good.
I didn't recognize the name there, but hi. Yeah, I'm not sure whether is Hunger one of the stories that you wrote more recently, or is it an older one?
Hunger actually was a really early story, and so the Hunger that I used, that's a really interesting one because it can mean so many different things. I suppose I've used it as prompts, when I'm teaching and stuff, and it really kind of it's like so interesting how different people respond to it. So Hunger is about a young girl who's about, what age is she? She's about 14, and her mother she's from the north but living in the south, and her mother has just gone into labour, and it's the day that Bobby Sands died. So that's where the hunger comes from. But I guess, she's homesick and lonely and whatever. Yeah.
Bobby Sands being a famous hunger striker, just in case that connection was lost. One last comment, and then I'm going to call in Javier. From Rachel, she said, just wanted to say I really loved Trespasses and immediately ordered your short story collection after finishing. And that's always one of those things where you want to go, well, Thank you. For the Riverhead edition. But no, if you can't wait. But yeah, it's incredible. So Louise, congratulations. I poured a glass of wine at the beginning of this and I've been abstaining.
You haven't drunk it? You're very good.
But just to raise a toast to the book, it is a real pleasure to have your voice among the Irish canon. And I said of your short story collection when it came out that I really felt that suddenly there was something where there had been a hole. So it really felt like it had to be there, that it's that you're able to kind of write experience in a way that feels that it's not, I've not read it on the page before, and it's very reassuring to know that someone can do that, and to know that that way of seeing the world and experiencing the world can be experienced by readers, can be met and kind of recognized. So yeah, I don't know, reassuring and also, enlivening and certainly makes me want to be a better writer. So
you're very kind, honestly. Thank you so much, and thank you for this. It was great.
Not at all. My pleasure. So I think Javier will probably pop on now just to give any final notes, and then Louise will be heading off to her other live event.
That was wonderful. As always, Caoilinn, you came very prepared and had great questions. And Louise, it was an honor to host you. I think this book.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege. I'm really delighted that you had me. Thank you.
Yes, I thank Caoilinn. Caoilinn, like I was saying before we logged on, does all the heavy lifting for this series. Thank you so much, Caoilinn, for being such a great book citizen and bringing these amazing writers to us all over the globe. So thank you all so much for coming out today. You can buy books, signed copies, go to the website in the link in the chat, and we'll be happy to ship all over the States. We're looking forward to next year. Caoilinn, we'll talk about this. We really do treasure these events. They're really good for us and for our customers and for everyone and for the writers that you host. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Javier. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.